Good afternoon. We're actually going to get started, and I'd like to first welcome you all. My name is Meg Satterthwaite, and I'm the Faculty Director of the Bernstein Institute for Human Rights. I am going to start by doing a few old-style Academy Award thank yous, and then I will give a couple of very brief remarks about the conference, and then we'll go right into the first panel. So that's the roadmap. First, I'm just thrilled to welcome you to this conference, and I want to welcome you. If you don't find a seat on the outside, please come on into the internal space here. You're very, very welcome. The Bernstein Institute is named after an extraordinary man, Robert L. Bernstein, who's a prominent human rights advocate and publisher. He served as a president of Random House for 25 years. After being sent to Moscow as part of a delegation of publishers in 1973, he established the organization that later became Human Rights Watch. Since then, he's been a pioneering voice for human rights. A key architect of the worldwide movement to protect free speech, his influence has been and continues to be crucial. It's fitting, therefore, that this conference, which examines some of the new threats to core human rights, should take place just as Bob's memoir entitled Speaking Freely is being published. To Bob, I want to offer my congratulations on your book and my gratitude for your visionary leadership. To the entire Bernstein family, I extend my enormous thanks for entrusting NYU Law with an institute bearing the name Robert L. Bernstein. To our Dean, Trevor Morrison, I thank you for the honor of serving as faculty director of this institute. And I'd like to thank a number of our sibling institutes for the intellectual leadership and partnership in this conference. Professor Michael Posner and Sarah Leibowitz, directors of the Stern Center for Business and Human Rights. Professor Jerry Cohen and Ira Belkin, directors of the U.S. Asia Law Institute. Sharon Hom, executive director of our new China and International Human Rights Law Research Program. And Professors Sally Mary and Philip Alston, who are faculty co-directors along with me of the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice. I also want to thank the staff of the Bernstein Institute. First, Gabrielle Royal, who's done tireless work to put together the conference. Our indefatigable intern, Nilofar Panshiri, who's done an incredible amount of both substantive and admin work for the conference. And above all, I want to thank Rebecca Hamilton, Deputy Director of the Bernstein Institute, who really was the intellectual author of many parts of this conference, and I'd like to thank her for all of her work to put this together. That's it for the thanks. Now I want to say a few words about the conference itself, and I promise again to be very brief. I want to start by addressing the conference title and the framing of our inquiry. Then I'll say a little bit about the subtitle, and then we'll invite the members of the first panel to begin. The title of the conference was a bit of debate, was the subject of a bit of debate. The phrase tyranny of the algorithm has a serious pedigree. It's been used by the media, it's been used by policymakers, and of course it's also been used by scholars. The question mark seemed a little bit too feeble, perhaps. Could it do enough work to ensure we appreciate and embrace the promise of algorithmic tools? For this reason, I want to kick off the conference with a brief appreciation of the algorithm and more broadly of data-driven decision tools. As a scholar, I spent a significant amount of time and energy dissecting, critiquing, and one could say hand-wringing about the use of data in human rights contexts. In part, that's because human rights data is almost always deeply problematic. It's biased, it's incomplete, it's often out of date, and frequently it's actually simply a lie. There will be governments that will simply put data out that's just absolutely not true. And the quantification of human suffering is also incredibly difficult, and there are many areas of our work that are simply not quantifiable in any straightforward manner. But as an advocate for populations marginalized by the global economy, I've also found community-owned and generated data, persuasive data visualization, and the discourse of quantification to be a powerful discourse from which to speak truth to power. So when we think about the problems that algorithms bring, it's important to recall what the alternatives are. Some of those alternatives are the kind of biased decision-making that human rights advocates set out to defeat on a daily basis. Racial prejudice, gender discrimination, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia. All of these biases, even in their inchoate forms, have been shown to have powerful effects on decision makers, policymakers, judges, police. If algorithms go some way to ridding this important decisions of bias that lead to discriminatory outcomes, human rights advocates should perhaps welcome their proliferation. The question, of course, then is, do they minimize bias, or do they shift it, transform it, and perhaps magnify it? And of course, the proliferation of the tools returns us again to the potential for a tyranny of the algorithm. Why a tyranny? As human rights advocates, we don't use this term lightly. Its use is intended to call attention to the pervasive power of quantified knowledge and machine learning, of lines of code that are obscured but ever present. It's also meant to highlight the potential for algorithms to displace human judgment, perhaps more accurately to hide and perhaps transform the judgment inside what's been called a black box. It's our intention to focus attention on this object that promises to bring more reasoned decision-making by turning data into prediction. And as we do so, we want to intentionally ensure we maintain a global context for this discussion, where governments, democratic and authoritarian, have joined with the private sector, for good and perhaps for ill, to cooperate, compete, and above all, extend their reach into all realms of our lives. This year's annual Bernstein Conference is dedicated to looking at both sides of this coin then. The posited tyranny and also the question mark. We seek an in-depth discussion of both, or maybe it's better to say all sides. The conference is also an attempt to bring together experts from a wide variety of disciplines and expertises to spark a conversation that in the human rights space is really just beginning. We're hugely honored to have many of the pioneers of this conversation here at this conference. And we will ask them to think about what the human rights implications of discussions that they've already began and had in depth in other spaces might be. It's a difficult conversation, in part because we aren't used to having it across these discourses. And so what we've done is to choose to look at data-driven prediction in situations where human rights concerns might be said to be at their apex, where the state uses predictive analytics to guide its decisions about coercive force in policing, in counterterrorism, in pretrial detention. This raises new and unique concerns. With this conference, we aim to start this conversation, of course, not to be able to go too far in depth, but to get it started and hopefully to create some new connections. So let me just begin with a few priors that grounded the construction of the conference. First, we're determined to make this a fruitful, engaging space for all. We really do seek engaged discussion on topics that are often difficult. That means we'll have to try to really listen to each other. Second, we're committed to asking this human rights question. Although the human rights framework has not been comprehensively mapped onto the issues we'll be discussing, its core principles are unquestionably directly relevant. So as moderators and hosts, we will insist on asking panelists, presenters, and experts the human rights questions. We'll ask if human rights enhancing action is possible in this space, and how to address the human rights concerns associated with predictive analytics, especially in these three contexts that we've chosen as examples. We've chosen to organize the meeting as a series of interactive discussions instead of formal panel presentations. Therefore, I ask your forgiveness as I attempt to enforce our draconian time limits on the panelists. Each of the panelists could really give us about a 1 or 2 hour lecture and we'd all be enraptured. And so I do ask for your patience with that. In terms of the human rights framework, I just want to say a couple words. What do we mean when we're talking about the human rights framework? As Professor LaTanya Sweeney, who will be speaking next, has said, it's time to think big and bold because all of our main values are being, quote, redesigned through technology. Human rights are a big and bold framework. We ask that you think with us today and tomorrow about whether and how human rights might help in our assessment of algorithmic decision-making. So what do I mean by that? I mean two main things: substantive safeguards and procedural safeguards. So the substantive rights are the basic guarantees that we're all familiar with: the right to privacy, the right to non-discrimination, but there I want to underscore the right to substantive equality, which has some very positive attributes as compared to US law. and we can return to that. The rights of freedom of opinion, expression, and association. Under international law, these rights must be respected and protected in all realms, including big data, algorithms, and predictive analytics. The human rights challenge is to articulate what these rights actually have to say and where they cut. A key question moving forward is what those specific legal content of the rights might require. The procedural principles, including participation, transparency, and accountability, are frequently referred to as rights-based principles, and they're distilled from human rights law. And they are said to be relevant whenever powerful actors are acting in our lives. So the human rights challenge here is to figure out what meaningful participation of whom, transparency to whom, and accountability of what or who to whom would look like in relation to predictive analytics. During this conference, we'll engage with both the substantive and the procedural side of this challenge, asking about the human rights promise of algorithmic decision tools, examining the substantive human rights violations or perils entailed by predictive analytics, and also reaching for ways to ensure that the rights-based principles of participation, transparency, and accountability can be built into data-driven decision-making. We look forward to the debate and discussion, and we welcome you all. Now I'd like to welcome the first panel. And this is our first framing discussion. We have a few framing discussions this afternoon, and then tomorrow we will have more in-depth discussions where we go into these specific substantive areas. So the goals of this panel are to begin the discussion, try to get some key terms on the table that we can kind of refer to and refer back to, and also look at some of the example areas in a short snapshot. So as I've already said, these are contexts where the state's obligation to protect the rights of the public are at their apex. But also that means we have to remember under the human rights framework, it's not possible to trade one set of rights for another. The question is, how do you ensure protection of rights for all? So these are also all areas where bias and discrimination are frequently at play. The over-policing of Black and brown communities has become a subject of intense debate and discourse in the past few years, thanks to organizing efforts against policies like stop and frisk in New York City and social movements such as Black Lives Matter. New programs to counter violent extremism have been critiqued as based on a flimsy empirical base and entailing broad surveillance of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities in the US and abroad. And decisions by judges to detain defendants before trial on the basis of dangerousness and flight risk have been identified as spaces where racial, ethnic, and class bias may unconsciously express itself. In contexts like these, will data-driven decision-making have some human rights enhancing promise? This panel will provide a window into some of those questions. First, we'll hear from Dr. LaTanya Sweeney, who's professor of government and technology at Harvard. And I do apologize that I will be handing these 2-minute warnings. So thank you.
Oh, thanks. So let's see. I suppose I have to figure out how to get the slides up. It's okay. Doesn't count. Exactly. Oh, well, let's see. It was supposed to be particularly embarrassing if I don't pull this off, as I'm a computer scientist, so that would really be not such a good idea, not a good thing. Thank you very much for having me here. It's great to be here with you today. Like I said, I am a computer scientist, and so I probably should begin with an apology for all computer scientists everywhere about some of the adverse consequences of algorithms. But it's also important to realize how invasive and interwoven they are into our daily lives. The rest of the panel will focus primarily on predictive analytics in the human rights context. My job is to show how our daily lives are being captured by these same algorithms. And there we go. Oh man. All right, hold on. Try this again. There we go. So one day I'm in my office and talking to a reporter, and we were looking for an old paper of mine. So I Googled my name, because Google is in fact a verb, and up popped this ad. And meanwhile, I showed him the paper. Oh, that's the link we want. He said, forget the link, forget the paper. I'm interested in that ad. Tell me about that arrest. And I said, well, I've never been arrested. And with a name like LaTanya Sweeney, there's not likely there's another one who also got arrested. And so I kind of tried to convince him, but eventually I have to click the link, pay this money to show him that the company actually had no arrest record. But as we began Googling more and more names, we started noticing that these names started showing up with these indicative of arrest, and in each of them there was no such arrest records. And he, being an Italian, of Italian-American descent, says, oh, right away, it's those black-sounding names. And I said, that can't be possible. I'm a computer scientist, after all, and computer algorithms don't do that. Google's not going to spend time to figure this out. And, but the more we searched, the more turned out to be true, until eventually I ended up doing an experiment in which I captured 120,000 ad deliveries. And sure enough, ads for searches on names where the first name was given to more black babies than white babies tended to produce these ads indicative of indicating an arrest, whereas names given more often to white babies tended to give these very neutral ads. And the disparity was an 80 to 20% of the time, which was a really huge and fit right into the Department of Justice's notion of sort of their litmus test of discrimination, meaning it would be eligible for an investigation. These kinds of things remind us not only that algorithms are making decisions all the time, but that the design of the algorithms is indicative of us living in what's basically a technocracy, where technologists, the design of it and its business practice basically dictates how we live our lives. This is the Pittsburgh Courier was one of the oldest and most respected black newspapers in its day. It had, at its peak, it had over 200,000 people who subscribed to it. They had a team of people who would review any ads to make sure none of the ads appearing inside the Courier would be offensive to its population. This is the Pittsburgh Courier today. It's an online website, and its ads are automatically delivered by Google. And today, there is no one reviewing. They get the ads that Google delivers. When I was the Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Trade Commission, we were interested in what kind of ads might Google be delivering on some of these sites. So this particular website is Omega Psi Phi, which is a long and highly respected black fraternity, and they were having their 100th year anniversary. And we looked at the ads that started showing up there. So there were ads about graduate programs. There were also ads about taking a vacation and so forth, all of which were appropriate. But there were also these other ads that started showing up, which seemed very inappropriate, also indicative of arrest and so forth. And there were also credit card ads. So we began looking at the credit card ads, and we noticed that only those credit cards which were harshly criticized, considered the kinds of cards you really want to avoid, were the only ones for ads that showed up there, whereas the highly praised ad cards never appeared, notwithstanding that there's no reason to believe the credit of that community would have been any different, especially since the most highly praised card, American Express Blue, tended to show up on exactly these kinds of educational sites. So that tells us that every value is also up for grabs. It's not just that the design of the technology is having an impact on how we live our lives, but that it's appearing in ways that you may not even be aware. This is also work from the Federal Trade Commission, developed what I call the exclusivity score. That is, we learned that if we were looking at households or using ComScore data from around the country, and looking at what domains did people visit. And what we were interested in was, what is the people's internet experience like? And what we learned is that everyone's top 10 is virtually the same, Google, Facebook, and so forth. But once you get around 10 and 11, huge deviations by demographics. So for example, this graph shows you people who visit websites who have children versus people who visit websites that don't have children. If you have children, there are domains that your household visits that nobody else, that the others don't visit. And of course they look like Disney.com and Nick Jr. and so forth. So we understand how this exclusivity works. But it's also true by income, it's also true by race, it's also true by combinations. This is an example from race. The red line is 2 standard deviations up, so something that's very high on this plot is something that's much more exclusive. The exclusivity score is basically the percentage of a group that visits that website divided by the sum of the percentages of all of the other groups. So when we look at that by race, for example, we see for blacks, we see World Star Hip Hop, and then we see surprisingly sort of footlocker.com. It's not clear why Foot Locker, the company that sells shoes and sneakers, is visited much more often by a higher percentage of blacks than by the other groups. Univision and some of the other India Times and Yoku.com are all respective to their particular races. We were able to use that kind of data in the FTC context to show fraud appearing. There's particular kinds of frauds that are specific to particular kinds of races, and we were able to see those kinds of activity happening within those domains. Because when you're around on a domain that's where more of the people are like yourself, you're more likely to have trust and therefore make you more easily victimized by the trust. So what do those examples really show us? Not only are our experiences shaped by the stereotypes of algorithms, but that stereotyping is another name for these algorithms, that they're making stereotypes based on not as you as an individual, which was what a lot of the privacy concerns have been around, but they're based on who you are, that you are who your group says you are, the places that you visit, the things that you do, your Facebook friends, your social networks, and so forth. And we're seeing increasingly the use of this kind of data as a proxy for you. There have been a few studies even on credit that, well, how good is your credit based on the credit of your peers or those in your social network. So I'm going to stop there and stay within my time, but my goal was to really open the door and also show you by those examples that the kinds of things talked about here are invasive in all of our lives all the time, and that the harms are harder to trace as a result, and it's harder to trace those who would be attributed to an individual action in addition.
Thank you so much. Now we'll turn to Jeff Brandingham, who is Professor of Anthropology and also the Director of Research and Development at Predpol. And if you can use that.
Okay, maybe I just go to the window. It doesn't have it. You know what? Let's just close it. Oh, let me see. Okay. 1 second. You see it? That one.
So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here to have this conversation with you. First of all, I want to start off by saying I am not here to defend all predictive analytics used in the context of law enforcement, so don't expect me to defend everybody and everything that's going on. There are many things that police and technologists may be doing and talking about that are certainly misguided, if not worse than that. But what I do hope to do is to give you a sense of the challenging problems that are faced by police and law enforcement on the streets every day, and in so doing, give you a sense of where the impetus for predictive analytics used in policing actually comes from. So first of all, I wanted to start off by just identifying where it is that I think the sort of 3 main domains that police operate in, and these are domains that police are entrusted by the public to actually be engaged in. Those 3 domains are response, meaning police are obligated to respond to crimes and disorder that's reported to them. 2, there's a role that they have in apprehension, which is given that there are people who are identified or warranted under the context of having committed a crime, police are responsible for apprehending or detaining those folks. And then there's an expectation, if not an obligation, for prevention. And it's in this context of prevention that a lot of predictive analytics are actually being deployed. And the big challenge here in the context of prevention really is one of uncertainty. And that's what this slide here up on the screen is all about. It looks like the animation's not operating. So The thing to recognize about prevention really is that it's all about uncertainty. When you look at what police have to deal with on a day-to-day basis on the streets, there is tremendous uncertainty about where and when crime is most likely to occur. That is, there may be a burglary that happened on a particular street segment yesterday, but is that a good guide to where burglary is going to happen today? Oftentimes it is not. The image on the left-hand side there is supposed to be an animation showing you that gun violence in Chicago is actually a highly dynamic phenomena on a day-to-day basis, that hotspots pop up, they spread, they disappear, and they pop up in other places on a very fine time scale. And if the public has an expectation of the police to be out there in front of those events, trying to prevent them before they happen, then that is a very challenging problem to try and solve. Where do I actually allocate my precious resources today, given that they are limited, that I'm having to respond to all sorts of other demands on that time? So there's this sort of spatiotemporal problem of knowing or having an expectation of where crime is going to occur today and how do I allocate resources. There's also the problem of being in any given circumstances on the street. What is the risk that is actually present in a given location? You know, we're often led to believe that risk is obvious the moment a police officer arrives on the scene of an event that's happened. The fact of the matter is that it is not obvious at all. And just think about it from a simple point of view of arriving in a location and saying, given what I'm seeing here, how long should I spend here? How long should I spend engaging a member of the public, talking to somebody, given that there are lots of other things going on in the environment that I may be responsible for dealing with? There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty that goes along with that simple decision-making that we have to recognize police are confronted with every day. So predictive policing, in my mind, is really simply about algorithmic methods that are designed to try and help reduce uncertainty in the decision-making that police officers have to make every day when they're on the street. Now, note that I didn't say eliminate uncertainty. Eliminating uncertainty is impossible. All you can try and do is try and reduce that level of uncertainty to help police officers try to make more informed decisions about how to allocate their resources and the tactics that they might engage in given the situations that are exposed to. So rather than talking about all the different mathematical or algorithmic ways you might go about trying to reduce that uncertainty, I thought I would just simply talk about the work that I've been involved in, and that is trying to figure out where and when crime is most likely to occur, given information about where past crimes have occurred. So I'll just lay out the three components of engaging in such a predictive policing enterprise. First of all, the only data that we've actually used in trying to deploy something like this is information about what type of crime is it, where did it occur, and when did it occur. This doesn't, notice what I didn't say here. I didn't say who are the offenders, what do they look like, what music do they listen to. I also didn't say anything about demographic characteristics or street network structures or the distribution of bars and churches or anything else like that. It really is just what crimes have been reported to the police, where did they occur, and when did they occur. That's it. So given that information, what can you do with it? There are hundreds, if not thousands, of different algorithmic approaches to dealing with that sort of data. What we've looked at is using well-founded mathematics that actually come out of the study of earthquakes, believe it or not, which allows you to characterize both the sort of distribution of risk in a fixed sense in the environment and also very dynamic short-term phenomena that are going on. And what do these mathematics do at the end of the day? They deliver a very narrow prediction about where and when crime is most likely to occur. And by narrow, I mean we're talking about 500 by 500 square foot locations that are present in the environment for the duration of a shift, 10 hours or 12 hours, and then they change from moment to moment in the time scale at which police officers are actually engaged in policing the environment. Okay, so they're very narrow and limited in their scope. Now, a key thing here is that no algorithm is actually going to stand up and walk out the front door and police the problem, right? Algorithms are actually things that deliver information that are put in the hands of police officers, and it's the police officers who are actually making decisions about how that information impacts where they go, what they do, what they think about. And everybody's thought process automatically goes to the idea that, well, police are using this information to target certain people, arrest them, and so on and so forth. But there are lots of other opportunities that are created by that information. If you think about it, and we've seen this anecdotally in many cases, predicting where and when crime is most likely to occur identifies for you the people who are at greatest risk of becoming a victim. And we've seen police officers use that information to actually engage members of the public to say, listen, by the way, I noticed that your garage is unlocked. Why don't you lock your door, right? That's a direct intervention in the case of impacting the risk of victimization, if you will. So, given the nature of what's going on with policing and using algorithms on the street, I wanted to finally point out that accountability and transparency actually really do matter. And you can think of this both from the point of view of the algorithmic side of things. How should you be transparent about the types of algorithms that are being used and how they're using? And accountability, how are they actually used in the field? So from a transparency point of view, I'd like to suggest that the best way to move forward with transparency is to do good science, right? To actually look at how the algorithms work, what's the theoretical foundations of those algorithms, and then ultimately take that to the next step, which is to use a clinical model and say, if we're going to put these things in the field, we need to do randomized controlled trials and testing of these things to demonstrate that they actually work in the way they say that they are supposed to work. But that's not enough in and of itself, right? I think that's of a necessity from the point of view of doing the science of algorithmic predictive policing. But at the end of the day, these things are being put into the hands of police officers or other law enforcement officials, and they, regardless of what those algorithms do, police officers have an obligation to police constitutionally or within the framework of human rights guidelines. Predictive policing or algorithmic policing or data-driven policing does not change that obligation in any way. Police officers are still obliged to follow all those guidelines. And with that, I'll finish up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we'll now hear from Jennifer Lynch, who is a senior staff attorney with the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Sorry about that. So I'm going to try and talk into this microphone over here. So I'd like to focus on algorithms that are specifically designed to predict crime, when it will occur, where it will occur, and sometimes who will commit it. And when you stand back and you hear that predictive policing systems are designed to reduce crime, I think that we would probably all agree that that is a worthwhile goal. But there's a different perspective that we need to take on this, and that is to think about the impact or the potential impact that predictive policing has on the people who are identified by predictive policing systems as more likely to commit crime, and on the communities that are predicted to be the locations where crime may occur. And that's because any time that the police focus on a person or on a community, and that focus increases in one area over another, it impacts human rights and civil rights on many different levels. It impacts people's ability to move freely about in their community and without fear of police suspicion. And it also increases the likelihood that someone will end up in jail. So I think that there are four main concerns that we need to be aware of when thinking about the impact of predictive policing on human rights and civil rights. And I'm going to use sort of a shorthand for these concerns. The first one is the garbage in, garbage out problem. The second one is the black box problem. And then we'll talk about mission creep a little bit and the impact on free will. So starting with garbage in and garbage out, I think it's a term that we all sort of know as a shorthand. But basically, algorithms in predictive policing can't predict crime that they don't know about. So all predictive policing systems, in one way or another, rely on historic crime data. We do know, the Department of Justice has told us, that historical crime data is incomplete. On average, only about 50% of crimes are reported. And a much higher percentage of crimes like simple assault or sexual assault or rape are never actually reported. Only about 35% of rapes or sexual assaults are ever reported. So you can only predict the crime in the future that you saw in the past, and you can only predict that it will occur in areas in the future that are similar to areas that where it occurred in the past. So that's an initial problem. But the other problem is that algorithms reinforce and hide past police bias, and they also justify police bias in the future. So we know that everybody commits crimes. Some people have said that all of us commit as many as 3 crimes a day. But only some crime is targeted for enforcement. And this is for many different reasons. Maybe it's police department priorities, maybe it's individual officer bias, maybe it's institutional bias. But we do know that some communities, races, and ethnicities are targeted more frequently than others. We have a history of racially biased policing in this country. We've seen this over and over again with the Stop and Frisk program right here in New York, research done on the LAPD, Chicago, all over the country. And all of this informs the historical crime data that is fed into a predictive policing system. But once it's incorporated into a computer algorithm, it appears to be impartial. And then it can be used as a justification to increase policing in neighborhoods that have historically already been subject to increased police attention. So it not only hides the racism that occurred in past policing, but it also hides unintentional and intentional bias in future policing. There's also a feedback loop problem. So if the data on the arrests and criminal activity that are reported as a result of predictive policing are then fed back into the system, this creates a feedback loop that both justifies the initial prediction of crime and ensures that police will continue to focus on the same areas as in the past. I see Patrick nodding, and I think he's going to address this tomorrow. And then the final problem with the garbage in, garbage out situation is that it shifts limited police resources to fighting crimes in areas that have been identified by the system. And the problem with this is that it takes police resources away from those crimes that haven't been identified. So the second problem that I think we need to think about in the human rights context is the black box problem. So at a fundamental level, we don't know how most predictive policing systems work. And I don't mean that we don't know how algorithms in general work and that we don't know how statistical analysis works. What we don't know is what exactly the data is that these systems rely on. We may know that PredPol relies on 3 data points, but there are many other predictive policing or predictive crime systems out there that rely on very different data points. Whether it's social network analysis or social media tools, we don't know. And this is due to trade secrets for a lot of companies, and it's also due to traditional police secrecy. But as Jeff mentioned, transparency and accountability are incredibly important in this area. How can you challenge the accuracy and reliability of a system, though, when you don't know how it actually works? This is a well-recognized right of the defendant in any criminal justice system to be able to challenge the accuracy and reliability of any technology that's used to implicate them in a crime. But we often don't have access to this now with proprietary systems. We also know that no technological system is infallible. Systems can be hacked, and we need to have access to data to show how the systems actually work. So even if systems are not used, like in the movie Minority Report, to predict a specific person will commit a specific crime at a specific time, they will actually be used to justify the reasonable suspicion to stop someone. So even for a crime that's completely different from one that's been predicted by the system, maybe the system predicts automobile theft, but a person is stopped because they look suspicious for carrying drugs, the fact that the system targeted that a specific crime would occur in that area gives the officers reason to be in that area, and they're more likely to suspect somebody is engaging in criminal activity. It's also used to justify increased police responses to criminal activity. Perhaps a system indicates that somebody is a greater likelihood of being violent, then the police are going to up their response to that situation. The third problem, I think, is mission creep. And this is that predictive policing systems might be reasonably reliable for certain crimes that are heavily reported, that the cops already know about. So we know that automobile theft is widely reported. Maybe this is because you need to get a police report in order to file an insurance claim. But we also know, like I said, that rape and sexual assault are not widely reported. So if you design a predictive policing system to find something like automobile theft, it doesn't mean that it should necessarily be used to find where the next shooting is going to occur. But we also know that once a technology is employed by a police department, they are more likely to use it for any possible situation that they possibly could. We've seen this with things like face recognition and biometrics in the past, with stingrays or cell site simulators. These are technologies that were originally designed for military use or justified to find terrorists, but now are being used to find even the lowest level crime. And then I think the final problem is a little bit more amorphous, and this problem of free will. This is maybe the most important concern of any kind of crime predicting system is that it challenges, thank you, it challenges our belief that people should be in control of their own destinies, that we all have free will to choose to not commit crime. And I think this is why predictive policing systems frequently remind people of the movie Minority Report. In that movie, I don't know how many people remember it, but just as a shorthand, you had a black box system that provided the Department of Pre-Crime with probable cause to arrest somebody before they ever committed a crime. That was limited to murder in the movie. And then, of course, although predictive policing systems are very different from Minority Report, we are fundamentally uncomfortable with the idea that an algorithm can predict what we will do before we even decide to do it, and a system that doesn't give us the opportunity to choose to do something different. So a system that makes it a foregone conclusion that a particular person will commit a crime, or even that a crime will occur in a particular community, takes away a person's free will and threatens the notion that we should be allowed to choose our own destinies.
Thank you very much. So now we'll hear from Rachel Levinson-Waldman, who is Senior Counsel with the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice here at NYU School of Law.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. And I have to say, just to pick up for a moment on what Jen was talking about at the end, I actually rewatched Minority Report a few months ago. I sort of felt like I had to. And I will say it's fascinating in part because I had forgotten that the ultimate message of the movie actually really is about free will. You remember the technologies and the prediction, but sort of the thrust of it at the end turns out to be very different. So I would commend rewatching it. So some of the same concerns that Jen has described about predictive policing in the domestic context, I want to articulate about the collection of big data in the international context, especially the refugee context, and then sort of about the use of predictive analytics in that context as well, which is inevitably premised on those stores of big data. And then I want to talk a little bit about some potential upsides, which I have to say does not, as somebody sort of focused on privacy and civil liberties, I'm not often talking about upsides in the context of big data and civil rights, but I think there are some interesting connections that are worth talking about. So first, the concerns when you're thinking about big data in the collection, especially of refugees, sort of in the context of the refugee crisis that's going on right now. So to start with, and this is maybe to state the obvious, there's information that's being gathered about people who are in very vulnerable circumstances and often at risk of persecution. Right now, and this is something that I've been educating myself about, the collection of data, the use of data, it's a very sort of digital process right now in terms of processing refugees, in terms of trying to get aid to refugees. There's, not surprisingly, a lot of information that's being brought in. Needless to say, it could fall into the wrong hands. And that doesn't even necessarily have to mean that it's being hacked, that it's being intentionally misused. It's just that this information is collected, it's inevitably going to be shared, and that could make people more vulnerable. So by way of example, the European Commission, when it started collecting information from asylum applications, said it was going to be totally protected. Then, not surprisingly, and this is very much sort of within the realm of the mission creep that Jen was referring to as well, it started sharing that information with Europol. So information that had been being brought in for a refugee and kind of asylum aid context was then being shared with international law enforcement. And particularly for people who are fleeing repressive regimes, giving an international law enforcement agency access, especially unrestricted access to that data, raises real concerns. The policy of the UN High Commission for Refugees also allows for transfer of their data to third parties. So there's one concern that data collected, certainly in the first instance, to help refugees will almost inevitably be used for other purposes. Second, there's a concern that's articulated that data collection and potential fears about misuse of that data could send migrants kind of off the grid entirely. So if they mistrust what's going to happen with that information, that they may not seek services that would be available to them in the first place. And then third, the simple fact that this method of providing aid, and I suspect there are a lot of good reasons that is a very digital process, results in the creation of a new class of people who are going to be tracked. So in this country, that tends to be people who have been through the criminal justice system, especially people who have been incarcerated, and that tends to be communities of color. Through this process, it will be refugees that are going to go into this kind of potentially permanent tracking system. So those are kind of the general big data concerns. There's a separate set of concerns that I think come up when you're talking about collecting this data and then using it specifically for predictive analytics and for risk mitigation, and especially in the context of trying to predict then who might engage in terrorist acts. And this could be either in the refugee context or just writ large, using predictive analytics for counterterrorism. So, for instance, there was an article several months ago in Defense One magazine suggesting that IBM is developing software or is kind of adapting software that they already have to try to predict which of the refugees coming into Western Europe may have been involved in terrorism in their home countries, or might become involved in terrorism, to try to either weed them out or flag them for extra scrutiny. Obviously there are concerns about sort of an influx of refugees trying to sort of analyze who's coming in, but it does raise some extra issues. So first, to the extent that there's sort of a notion that you can predict terrorism in the same way that you could predict something like credit card fraud, I think pretty much everyone who works on that agrees that those are very different contexts. That for credit card fraud, you have a huge base of data that you're working with. You actually can draw predictions out of that. That when you're talking about terrorism, there's simply not a big enough pool of data. There are, in fact, very few terrorist attacks. It may be different if you're talking about, and we can talk about this more in the discussion, if you're talking about people who have already committed something and trying to figure out who's going to be a recidivist, there may actually be more useful or more productive prediction that could go on in that context. But looking at a big group of people and trying to pull out who do we think is going to be involved, that generally there's not enough data to try to make that sort of prediction. And there is also the fact, as has been talked about, that those algorithms that are used are generally very opaque. And so even if we know what kind of information is going in, which we often don't, we generally know very little about how that data is being crunched, and that there could be, certainly in this context, kind of life and death consequences to the ultimate outcome of those algorithms. At the same time, one of the things that I think is really interesting is that there are a lot of examples, and again, I'm not on the ground, so I can't speak to how these are playing out, but there are a lot of examples of trying to use big data and trying to use predictive analytics for good in the refugee context, and I think it's interesting to think about how some of those same lessons could be drawn in the domestic context. So there are efforts to use data to help manage refugee placement within camps. So there are kind of examples cited of where to put groups of women and children, where to put groups of elderly refugees so that they're close to water and bathrooms, that they're close to other groups that are similar, so they're not having to make, long treks to get necessities where they may be vulnerable to attack. There's data that could help chart the growth and the pathways of sort of an exodus to see, okay, where might the next influx be coming in, to help do advocacy, to help set up support and resources. Could potentially find human traffickers or other offenses against refugees. So there was an article on trafficking of victims of sexual exploitation, saying that data analysts had discovered that the majority, or at least a higher number of calls for help, were coming in on Wednesdays. So something they were kind of able to pull out of this big data and help to figure out, okay, what's behind that, and is there a way to help? And so what struck me in looking at that is there's a conversation that's going on right now about predictive policing, and that came up especially in a conversation that Jeff and I were both at in the fall about to the extent to which there is data that's being fed into these systems that is pulling out information about where crimes might occur, who might be involved, who might be victims of crime, understanding and very much agreeing that there are the significant risks that LaTanya has identified, that Jen has identified, that there may be a different way of using that data, that instead of using it to conduct policing, that it may be possible to use it to conduct other kinds of intervention. So if what this data is identifying is communities that are particularly at risk, communities that are particularly in need, communities that are particularly sort of short of certain kinds of services, that may be one use for the data, especially at a point where there's a level of discomfort about to what extent does this data wrap in discriminatory policing decisions? What does this mean about an interaction with the communities? That maybe there are ways to use that data to accomplish different kinds of goals, and that some of what we're seeing in the international context could be a model for that.
Thank you so much. So what I'd like to do now is just, if any of you have comments for each other or want to respond to each other, I want to give you a brief moment, and then we can start into a conversation. And we'll take a couple of minutes to have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions from the floor.
I had a question. So predictive policing, so it matters the kind of crime, but also its success is also based on crime. So many of the studies that I tend to see will show, well, by having the police in a particular area, the crime went down, for example. And it's almost always robberies. And that's because robberies are of opportunity. And so if you put police there in a place where it's being hit, they'll just go somewhere else. But that doesn't mean that the robbery doesn't happen.
So that's a fantastic question, and it really gets down to the heart of what impact does policing have on crime in general, regardless of whether you're using a predictive policing algorithm or not. If you put police in a given location, does it actually have an impact on the probability of crime occurring there? And the answer appears to be, from decades of study, that it does actually have an impact. We could debate about what the mechanism is in that case. But interestingly enough, in studies going back into the late 1980s, the evidence for displacement of crime is actually quite limited, that it's actually the exception rather than the rule. And the reason for that, nobody knows exactly why it is, but sort of one possible explanation is that police, by moving into a particular location, are actually moving into an area where the offenders who might commit crime there actually find that to be their cherry patch, right? They find that to be the place where they feel comfortable to commit a crime. And if you take that away from them, the next place is just a little bit harder to commit a crime. And in that difference, they sort of sit back and they say, you know what, I'm going to hold off until the police aren't here. And in that time, that you've actually sort of interrupted their sort of normal routine activities, they actually don't commit a crime. And if you play that out over and over and over again, it actually reduces crime. And there are probably a couple of dozen studies on displacement of crime showing that actually it doesn't appear to be the norm of what happens.
Can I ask, in response to that, what is the time period for those kinds of studies? So for example, let's say you have an increase of policing for 6 months, that's your study, and you find that the crime has not been displaced over those 6 months. What about if you had an increase of policing for 2 years? Would then the crime, do you think, have there been any studies that have looked at whether crime then moves on? So you're just getting the same amount of, let's say if we focus on robberies, you're getting the same number of robberies, it's just they're occurring, they've moved on to another neighborhood, and it just took them a while to move on.
Right, so I guess the answer to that question is often we don't know. So for example, short-term displacement is something that has been studied quite well, and that short-term displacement does not appear to occur. So
And what is that?
Short distance and short-term duration displacement. So if you look at short distance, over the course of a couple of kilometers from any given policing site, regardless of whether it's predictive or not, it appears that you don't have displacement over that distance. And that sort of corresponds to people's awareness space. We were talking about this, right? They're just not as aware of what the targets are like 2.5, 3, 4 kilometers away, and so they don't go there. But in the case of the duration of that impact, it corresponds to how the nature of the policing that's gone on. And there's a half-life to that, right? So what often goes on in studies is that you'll put some type of policing activity or effort into a location, and then you take it away and you study scientifically how long does it take for crime to return back to its base level. And it depends on what you've been doing there, right? So if you have a community engagement program there, theory might suggest that, well, that half-life is going to be longer because you've done more to impact the social structure of what may be supporting crime. If you're just going in and doing high visibility policing, it may only be hours, right? So content really matters when it comes to policing, and it's actually one of the things that we know the least about in terms of actual activity on the street, the content of what police are doing.
I just wanted to follow up. The thing about the displacement is still not quite getting to the root of it. So for example, if you have a person who is committing robberies by snatching purses or something like that, you put a police activity there, then the kind of displacement we would use in this anecdotal example might work because the person doesn't have travel means to go to another neighborhood to produce it. But on the other hand, carjacking might now go up because now has to steal a car to get somewhere. And so the studies are always kind of not actually realistic to the way we would expect the crime to move. And so as a result, the results are kind of seem a little stilted because they don't seem to match the way the criminals would behave.
So I'll reassert that I'm not here to defend all policing, nor am I here to defend all predictive analytics, but I'm very interested in these questions nevertheless. I mean, I think they're very, very important questions. So I'll give you an example of the way I think about one of the challenges here, and this is something that comes up frequently in talking about predictive policing to law enforcement or anybody, and that is, so let's take an example of burglary theft from vehicle, which is a very common crime throughout the United States, in Los Angeles in particular. In Los Angeles, there's lots of evidence to suggest that people are engaging in burglary theft from vehicle in order to support, they have a drug dependency of some kind, right? So they're committing a petty theft in order to supply money to support their habit. Now, you can actually deploy hotspot policing or predictive policing or many other different tactics to try and deal with this problem of burglary theft from vehicle. And you may have a success at disrupting the offender from committing one or two or three of these particular crimes. Now, somebody might turn around and say, yeah, but you haven't solved the drug dependency, which is the root cause of the crime. And I would say, you're absolutely right. But if you walk into a roll call at a police department and you say to a patrol officer, your job today is to solve drug dependencies, meth dependency, they're going to throw their hands up and say, I can't do that. I don't have the tools to be able to solve drug dependency or mental health or poverty or any of those other things that may be the root causes of crime. At the end of the day, that patrol officer has to be on the streets for 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, and their job is to try and make the community safer in the time that they're on the street. And that's where I see predictive policing fitting in. It's not about replacing efforts to solve root causes of crime. Absolutely, we need to do all those sorts of things, right? It's about how do you actually give an officer a tool on the street to help improve what they're actually mandated to do during that time. So those things should work in concert together rather than against one another. That's my thinking.
Well, I think that actually gets to, Rachel, to your point that these analytical tools can be used in different ways and could be beneficial if you just sort of flip them on their head. So instead of using a predictive policing tool to find theft from automobiles, you're trying to find where there is a higher incidence of drug dependency so you could focus social efforts in those locations.
Right, I think that's right. And one of the things I was going to say as I was talking is this is not necessarily, I certainly recognize that there is policing that needs to be done. We need to have police forces, we need to have sort of a public safety infrastructure in place. I do think part of what troubles me is a lot of the issues that Jen raised and I think articulated very clearly about concerns. I mean, I think, Jeff, one of the things that you had raised was sort of, our officers sort of going on the street with the intent to use these algorithms in a discriminatory way, which I suspect by and large they're not. Maybe some are, but probably many are absolutely going on the street with kind of the best, best efforts, right, and sort of doing the best job that they can. Or the question of kind of do the algorithms work, which I do think raises for me the same concern that Jen had said, which is kind of what does it mean for them to work? With respect to the information that's going in, they may be working in terms of feeding back out kind of the natural corollary of that information. I share the same concerns about what's going in and sort of, and how that's crunched, and if it's even possible to get something on the other end that isn't suggested by the initial data, because sort of how would that work? And I guess that does speak to, if we're going to use the data in part to do the social services piece, there's also, in some ways, the risk of getting that wrong is also a little bit lower, because you're using it in part to put in, sort of supportive services.
So one thing I want to ask about is, there's a lot of concern about discriminatory impacts or discriminatory outcomes, however you want to think about this. What are some tools to actually get at that? There's obviously the garbage in, garbage out problem, there's the over-policing problem, there's the inadequacy of the data that we start with, then there's the algorithmic kind of magnification of some of those problems. Can you talk to some of the approaches for both identifying those problems and then actually responding to them? Any of you?
I'd actually love to hear from you, Latanya, on this, because I feel like this is sort of the heart of your work. Where have you gone with the study on names and Google searches?
Well, two things. One problem is with respect to the policing algorithms is that before you can even talk about the discriminatory impact, is what is the utility really? I mean, if I can't trust the results that they report back for the reasons that we've been talking about, we don't actually, no one, as far as I can tell, no one actually can show that they're any better than not using them and just using regular policing. And so it kind of, to me, that's kind of the first question of these algorithms in terms of how they're used that way. Did you want to respond to that, and then I'll talk about that?
I strongly believe in randomized controlled trials, and that you have to demonstrate efficacy against existing best practice. And that's actually where we got started as a group of geeky researchers trying to, study crime, and you can go see the results in the Journal of the American Statistical Association. So randomized controlled trials absolutely matter, and we should hold these algorithms to higher standards, right? And not just have it be, oh, it sounds great, it sounds like Minority Report, sounds like whatever is going to work. No, does it actually work? I mean, that's a really important question, and it should be asked of everything.
But there haven't been any private independent studies, to my knowledge, other than a RAND study in Shreveport, Louisiana, I think it was.
Right, yeah. So you can go and look at the research that was done in Los Angeles in the Journal of the American Statistical Association.
Right, but didn't you write that?
I did write that, and so it's acknowledged in there that there is a conflict of interest, but it's entirely transparent about how you would go about doing the exact same study should you choose to. That's just the nature of the way it is. As long as you can identify what those potential conflicts are, that's the best we can do, right?
Well, I think we could do better. I think we could definitely do better testing. Because even the randomized trial sounds good when it's actually randomized trial, but it depends on what the measure is, whether or not it has hidden confounders of the kind that we've talked about. And so I do think that that's a place where some good effort could be done. That is, independent eyes who are aware of some of the confounders actually doing that analysis in an open way would be helpful.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more.
On the ads, the ads are kind of interesting because you could ask yourself, well, why did that happen? Was it that there was just this bad actor who placed these ads and was placing the ads disproportionately on black names than white names? Or was it a reflection of society? Because the way Google's algorithm works is you give it a bank of ads and it will display the ad for a search that it thinks will make the most money for it, that it will get a click. So the more often you click the ad, the more often that ad would appear. So if everyone had an equal number of arrest ads and an equal number of neutral ads, then clicking on the arrest ads for black names and clicking on the neutral ads for white names would also account for that effect. And the third one is there some other bias in the algorithm? And there may be a little bit of responsibility both ways, but what I also find really interesting is that it's almost as easy as it was to test, is as easy as it would be for Google to make sure that it never happens. You know, it's very easy to look at the sentiment of an ad and determine whether or not it's having an adverse impact. Am I delivering it too often to a protected group? It's not that in the United States, we don't forbid all discrimination. We only forbid discrimination of certain protected groups in certain settings. And those particular kinds of settings in this algorithm would be something easy to protect. Answers to the question of the ads have fallen on all three. FTC issued there was a complaint and so forth against the company, and they ended up paying a fine. Google has not modified its algorithm to have that responsibility. And there are evidence of the clicking, because during the time I collected the 120,000 ads was an elections year. And it turned out that everyone except for Claire McCaskill lost their election if they got an arrest ad and won if they didn't, which is kind of interesting.
Can I ask a question, actually following up on this? I mean, one of the sort of issues that's come up, and again, I'm also going to point to Patrick Ball, who's sitting in the audience, is thoughts about whether, you know, to the extent that the algorithms are sort of putting out useful information, this goes back to the question of inadequate crime data, that it might be more useful or more genuinely predictive to look at the kinds of crimes that we know do tend to be reported, you know, more or less reported when they happen, right? There are some that really aren't. You know, drug crimes obviously are very disparate in terms of both reporting and enforcement. There are others, but there are some serious violent crimes that if it happens, it tends to be reported, and that might produce sort of more accurate outcomes on the other side. And I'm just curious if that's something, you know, understanding that, you know, that Predpol is a company and is trying to sort of build a product that police departments think is going to be useful to them, and they're probably interested in that on a range of crimes, not just the ones that tend to be more widely reported. But if that's something that you've thought about, that seems like sort of a legitimate way of distinguishing between the kind of data that could produce, you know, a prediction that would actually map onto what's out there. I'm curious what your take has been on that.
So I'm a strong believer in keeping separate the predictive analytics, the algorithmic side of things, and policy decisions. That I think if you bake policy decisions into the algorithmic process itself, then it becomes less transparent, right? So I'm often thinking about, rather than saying, you know, we'll take in all your crime and we'll weight it according to whatever we think theory tells us is most important, and spit out something that has all of that weighting going on in the background. You say, listen, you can do prediction on any type of event whatsoever. I mean, you could use what's going on here to predict restaurant visitation patterns. I mean, it's the same sort of thing. It just looks at events. It's really up to the policymakers and the police, or the city, or the drug intervention workers, whoever it happens to be, to decide what types of events they want to focus on and what types of events they believe that they have the tools, the strategies to deal with. To keep those things separate, I think, is very, very important, because if you start to bake it into the math itself, then nobody really knows what's coming out of it. If you effectively, when you look at prediction, you know, we can treat burglary, theft from a vehicle as an equivalent in terms of where it occurs, when it occurs, to a homicide, right? It's really up to the policymaker, the end user, to decide, okay, which one of those things is most important to my community, and I'm going to focus on using predictions in that way.
And, oh, sorry, I was going to ask, so the burden might be on a police department to say, okay, we think, I mean, they could say there are these 10 crimes that are really important to us, but actually we think that 5 of them are wildly underreported. So we're going to make the decision to ask you only to crunch the data on these other 5.
That's
and
right.
that would be their decision in
Yeah,
terms
they
of
make
what
a
they're asking
decision,
for.
and so as a common example, I often talk with the police department, and I say, listen, you have other tools for dealing with domestic violence. You have other tools for dealing with rape. This is not necessarily the most appropriate tool for that. It's also not the most appropriate tool for say, shoplifting, but for different reasons. Police feel powerless in dealing with shoplifting. So you could produce predictions on shoplifting day in, day out, and the police will never want to use it because they essentially feel powerless in doing anything about that. distinguishing between what is being said by any sort of predictive policing technology, which is where's the risk of crime greatest today in the next 10 hours or the next 12 hours, and what police officers can and do with that is really important. You have to keep those two things conceptually distinct so that they recognize where their decision-making actually comes into play. In fact, this says nothing about what police are supposed to do with the information. In fact, everybody knows, everybody thinks they know what the best thing police should be doing, right? But at the end of the day, they're the ones who actually have to put it into practice. So they have to recognize their accountability in that space. And being clear about that to them is part of the process of making sure that, or trying to ensure that such technologies as predictive policing are used in an accountable way.
I think I have two concerns with it, and not necessarily anything about how PredPol in particular operates, but there are other data analytics companies that would love to sell their technology to every police department to use in every situation. And police departments are reliant on companies in their sales pitches. They buy the technologies because the company says that this tool will solve all their problems as a police department, when in fact the tool may be useful in a certain limited number of situations, but the police department buys it and then uses it for every different type of situation. So this is this mission creep problem. So this is my first concern with that is, yes, I agree that you don't want to bake these things into the system, but there has to be some responsibility somewhere along the lines to determine if the system is actually effective for what it's being tasked with doing. So I think that's the first concern, but I think the second concern I talked very briefly about is this reasonable suspicion problem, and that is that predictive policing systems give cops a justification to be in a specific neighborhood at a specific time where they might not necessarily be if the system hadn't told them to do it. The way that our reasonable suspicion body of law has developed in this country is that if you have a reason to suspect that crime will occur in a certain area, and there is somebody who sort of fits the model of what a criminal might look like in response to that kind of crime, then you have reasonable suspicion to stop that person and search them, ask them for their identification, ask them what they're doing in an area. And then if you find that they have some sort of, they're carrying drugs, or they have an arrest record, or they're wanted for an arrest, you now have reasonable suspicion to justify the detention and justify the future arrest. But the law enforcement officer wouldn't necessarily have been in that location beforehand. And what if the crime that the predictive policing system tells them that they should be looking for is automobile theft, but then they find somebody with drugs, or they find somebody who has an outstanding arrest warrant? It doesn't really matter the way that our Supreme Court case law has gone. The fact that there is some reason why they think that there is criminal activity that's going to occur in this area gives them the reasonable suspicion to stop somebody.
I completely agree with you. This is actually, so I'm not a lawyer, obviously,
Right,
so
I
I
know,
may be
this is not a problem that you can
the only person up here who's not. Okay, thanks. I actually am very concerned about this as well, because the pretense for stopping somebody and searching them, right, detaining them, is probably pretty easy to establish in most circumstances, right? And that's a grave concern. I don't think predictive policing necessarily changes that in any fundamental way. I think that that's an issue that we need to address in a broader context of appropriate training, appropriate understanding of what the limits of police power actually are, rather than the algorithms themselves. I totally support exactly the concerns that you're raising, that we need to figure out how do these things work together so that you can police constitutionally with information that helps you make decisions in a way that actually supports constitutional values or human rights values. I mean, I think I think that's what this whole, that's my reason for attending here, is to figure out how to make that more of a reality. The truth of the matter is, I worry about this because, if we give people police powers, right, which we do, right, we give people police powers, the moment they step on the street, there's always a risk of violation of civil liberties, constitutional rights, human rights. There is always a risk. No predictive policing algorithm is going to remove that risk, and anybody who claims that it does is just simply wrong, right? It doesn't remove that risk. And so that mandates that there has to be training, there has to be understanding, there has to be education, there has to be appropriate use of these things. Man, I think we would all agree that that's the case. So.
Can I just add one thing, and this is maybe to put an even finer point on it. I agree that predictive policing itself isn't sort of creating the reasonable suspicion concern. If an officer ends up in a neighborhood and sees things that give him or her reasonable suspicion to make a stop, then that is what it is. I think the concern has been, are courts going to start to see that algorithm as literally providing one of the pieces of reasonable suspicion, right? So it's not even so much, is predictive policing kind of doing something wrong in that context, but will it become so accepted and also seen as neutral, when even if the algorithm, even if the people building the algorithm are making every attempt to make it neutral, we know that some of the information feeding into it isn't, but will it be seen as neutral enough that a court will say, okay, well, we have the algorithm, check, now we only need, say one other piece of evidence to make our determination. And I agree with Jen, that's not something that you can solve, but it is one of the concerns, I think, specifically.
Thank you. I actually think that's a huge concern, and I do think it is the type of concern we've seen with data in general, certainly in human rights contexts, where data takes on a certain patina of neutrality, as you were saying, and that can give it all sorts of power that perhaps the we that we're talking about would not give it. And I think the we question is one I also wanted to ask. We haven't really talked about communities most affected and sort of how they relate to, it's a hard they to talk about, but if we're talking about things that are inherently kind of opaque because of their black box nature or because they're technologically difficult or they're hard to understand, who is creating a participatory space to have the kind of discussion that needs to happen to ensure really this kind of democratic accountability that we're talking about? To the extent that we or some we that's been undefined knows that there are these limits to the algorithms that we're talking about, how is that popularly known? And here I'm including judges who often rely on sort of folk knowledge, right? What are the human rights kind of imperatives to ensure that conversation is taking place? That's one question. And then does anyone see any good inroads there around positive types of transparency, participation, engagement?
Well, I think this is a follow-up on to what she's saying. It's really important in order for the judicial system to work, to actually have vetted in a scientific way the algorithms. And because otherwise you end up with one side saying something about the algorithm and the other side, or Lord forbid, you end up with two experts on two different sides. And so there really does have to be, a kind of a standard set. And I think that's very important, for the reasons for judicial decisions.
Yeah, I absolutely think that there's going to be a space to educate judges. And I feel like we're seeing this in different contexts. There are a lot of other technologies that are being used in the policing context. So, a lot of these surveillance technologies, license plate readers, cell phone trackers, things like that, right? And increasingly, there are amicus briefs being submitted to courts saying, you need to understand not just the legal framework, but literally to understand the legal framework, you also need to understand the technology. And so I suspect that will start to happen also in the predictive policing context. And there's also, the Department of Justice is interested in predictive policing. I think they've been public about that and sort of trying to figure out what kinds of guidelines to suggest. To the extent that that's going to trickle down to the public at large, I don't know, but at least in the judicial context, I think there either are or will be. I think will have to be some efforts on that score.
Yeah, let me just say one thing. If it comes down to the judicial process, helping us to understand the relationship between technology, that is just like, why not just toss a coin in the air and see which way it comes out?
Okay, I'd like to make sure that we include everyone sitting here. We've got a lot of really informed and engaged folks here. So I'm going to open it up, and I'm going to call in Patrick first since he's been invoked several times. I apologize for asking this, but we need to get you to a microphone because we are webcasting. Yeah, there's one right here.
Yes. I really appreciate the commitment to doing good science, but I think you glossed over the important part of the science. As Jen noted and other people mentioned, we only have a tiny fraction of crime, half in other types of crime, less than half, that becomes known to police. We have lots of reasons to believe that there's a systematic difference between the crimes that are known to police and the crimes that are not known to police. You and I have debated before, and you've acknowledged in your published work that, in fact, the validity of the PredPol predictions depends on a constant reporting rate of each crime across communities and space and time. Not constant for all of them, but given a community, it has to be constant over time, given a type of crime and so forth. I think that's very problematic. I think that's incorrect. We can talk about that another time. I think there's a bigger problem even than that. I love algorithms. I work with them all the time, and I'm really convinced that they find patterns. They find patterns between the features we give them and the dependent variable we're trying to predict. And in the PredPol case, what we're giving them is crimes known to police and asking them to predict what? And I put to you that, in fact, you're predicting crimes that will be known to police. So my question then is, would you support changing the name of the field from predictive policing, which seems very broad, to rather predicting policing? Because I think quite literally what you're doing is predicting what the police are going to know and what they would have done in the absence of your algorithm, which may be an explanation for why it's so warmly welcomed by them, because you're in fact providing them an algorithmic form of confirmation bias.
Well, I didn't come up with the name predictive policing, so you can thank the National Institutes of Justice for that. You can write to them and ask them to change it to predicting policing if you want to. That would be fine. I'll respond by actually answering to Rachel's question here by saying, actually, if you look at what law enforcement is actually doing with predictive policing, there's a great example that comes out of the UK, where they actually aren't using predictions to task response officers at all. They're using those predictions to task drug intervention workers, community service workers, to go and engage the community. That's it, right? It's not necessary that you use this in any way to ensure that police are going to show up and police a certain way in a community. You can use this information in any way that you see fit. At the end of the day, though, the impact of any sort of policing approach in the field should be evaluated according to whatever standards the scientific community establishes, whatever standards the human rights community establishes, whatever standards the government establishes. Of course, all this is very new. And as a result, many of those standards just have not been established as of yet. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about what those standards should be, right? And how they should be implemented and who should be responsible. Should it be judicial responsibility? Should it be an FDA-style governmental body that establishes what are standards for appropriate use of algorithmic tools in these sorts of spaces? I don't know what the answer to that is. But again, I won't speak for the entire community. This sounds like it was an attack on me in particular, but I think there's a lot more going on than just my own work in this predictive policing space, a lot of which I'm equally concerned about.
It's funny because I thought where you were going with that was, at the end of the day, the money is in policing. And I think this is one of the problems, because yes, you're right, the algorithms could be used to do many different things, but the money is with the police departments. The money is with the Department of Justice issuing grants to police departments to specifically purchase specific types of technologies, whether that's body cameras in some contexts or predictive policing technology in other contexts. So I think that is something that we could also think about here, is how do we get the funding to use these kinds of technologies in a way that could address these underlying fundamental problems with society in a way that society benefits rather than more people being incarcerated.
Thanks very much. I'd like to take another, okay, I'll take all the way in the back there. There, you can either use one here or you can take them.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Harlan Yu from Upturn. So it seems like measuring crime is just one small sliver of what we care about in terms of police-community relations. Not only is the community interested in reducing crime, the community is also interested in reducing the amount of police misconduct, reducing the amount of use of force, increasing community trust and legitimacy. I could certainly imagine a situation where, over a year, crime actually stays the same, but there's much less misconduct, much less use of force, and I think we would see that as better policing overall. So I was wondering if I could, get some comments from the panelists about whether this might be a way to improve this field and maybe some of these systems going forward.
Sounded like your point. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you said, what I heard you say, was a concern that actually it would also have negative effects on those things too.
Well, I think it depends on how you use it. So one system that's completely different from Predpol that's been written about is this other system called Beware that supposedly relies on social media posts and a whole host of other data that we have no idea what it is, and we don't know how that data is even being weighted in the analysis. But one of the articles that was written on this technology said that the police department was using it to predict whether somebody was going to be, whether a suspect or a target was going to have a violent response to police showing up. And we know that if police think that the person is more likely to be violent, then they are going to up their response, and then there's a higher chance of violence. So I think that's definitely a concern. We know that that does happen. But actually what I thought might be interesting in response to Harlan, what you had asked is, we can use algorithms to try and predict anything, right? We could look at crime data from the past and police responses to crime, and instead of trying to predict where the next crime is going to occur, use it to predict why did they respond with use of force in the past, and how do we prevent that in the future? But it's a different algorithm, right? I don't know that in that situation you could take exactly what Predpol is doing and predict whether somebody's going to use force in the future. But I think that we have data that somebody could crunch and figure that out, and that could be used as a training tool for law enforcement officers.
And there already has, and I don't know if this is part of what Jen was referring to, but there was an article a few weeks ago saying that there is sort of experimentation with doing algorithms specifically for that, right? To see which officers are engaging in sort of disproportionate uses of violence and what might suggest that in the future. So I thought one of the interesting examples was an officer that has been sent on, I think it was either a domestic violence call or a call that has resulted in a use of force earlier in the day is then more likely to use force later in the day. So that could actually be incredibly helpful for dispatchers to use. There was another example, which was officers that are, as I'm sure is the case for all of us, officers that are going through difficult circumstances personally may then be more likely to use of force. I think that raises huge privacy concerns, understanding that officers have a heightened obligation to the community. At the same time, they are people engaged in a difficult job, and I think there are concerns when you say, well, we want to know everything about your debts, your mortgage, your personal life. Are you going through a divorce to figure out what calls to route you towards? That, I think, raises some of the concerns that we would be worried about in any other context.
Hi, I'm Catherine Erickson. I'm with the Center for the Prevention of Genocide. And we have a project called the Early Warning Project, where we use analytics to prevent potential atrocities, or to predict places where atrocities may take place. I've heard you speak a lot about problems with predictive policing using the United States. I was just wondering whether or not you've heard of it, what's your take, and ways to avoid going wrong. There's certain issues we already know about. For example, dictatorships tend to publish less data. Conflict zones have uncertain death counts, so there's bias issues. A lot of the information that we deal with, that we rely on in making predictions, is published annually, so there's always going to be a slowness and on. But just love to get your take.
I would actually direct that question to Patrick tomorrow on his panel, who just is sitting right here in the third row. Just because Patrick has done a lot of statistical work related to human rights.
Great.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Yes, way over here.
I just wanted to ask, sorry, I'm crouching over, Jennifer, just a bit more about what you said towards the end of your presentation about free will, because one of the things that strikes me about your interaction discussing turning algorithms on their head is that free will seems like quite a fragile concept in these settings, and human rights advocates like to obviously presume that people have free will and that they have self-determination, but also that they can be oppressed greatly by their social conditions, which can mean that they behave in ways that perhaps they don't intend to. Do we need a more sophisticated process of thinking about free will in this particular space so that we don't fall into error in either direction?
I think it's a really good question, and I don't actually know the answer to this. And I think I keep bringing this back to Rachel's point, but in my mind, what I think is necessary is to think about using algorithms for good rather than for ways that threaten civil rights or human rights. So using an algorithm to try and predict what community needs social services, what community can be benefited by something, or how do you respond to the fact that crime might be more likely to occur in a neighborhood. How do you respond instead of with excess policing, which presumes that the crime is going to occur, and so you're going to make sure the police officer is there to arrest somebody. But how do you respond in a way that doesn't result in somebody else being incarcerated or hassled by the cops? So when I look at the free will problem, I think you could use the same algorithm, but have your response to that algorithm and the results from the algorithm just be different. But like I said, I don't know the answer to that because, of course, you think about consumer companies, credit reporting agencies, banks, they all crunch data and make predictions about us, and some of them are wrong, but a huge percentage of them are statistically correct, just in terms of the likelihood to engage in fraud, for example. If you have the right data, you can make those predictions, and in that situation, you could say, well, maybe I am not, like I want to not shop at J. Crew all the time, but something about who I am and my friends, and just means I'm going to go to that website. And I like to think that I'm not going to, but there I am at the end of the day. I'm not saying I shop at J. Crew all the time, but just as an example, I think it's my free will, but it's made up of a lot of different factors. And humorous response to a very real problem, I think, in society.
I also think that free will, I think this is an important point about free will and living in the space of these algorithms. Because when you don't want the consequences, you start changing your own behavior. And so it's kind of insidious, this issue, its ability to erode our free will.
I actually think that's a good place to stop for the moment. I'd like to thank the panelists. I think you all teed up some of the key issues that we need to go into and have given us some tools for thinking about them. Thank you all. There's going to be plenty of time for continued discussion, and now I invite you to have some coffee.